So the first thing that I want to talk about today is the class that I'm observing. So the number of students, there's 29 students in this class in Settlement Canyon Elementary in the Tooele Country School District, and in where 9 of those students are English language learners. So that's around 31% of the classroom. Settlement Canyon Elementary is one of the 4 school districts in Tooele County that has a decent percentage of English language learners. Other schools, elementary schools in the district, usually only have about 1 to 5 students in each class that are English language learners. I'm really interested in Settlement Canyon especially and their approach to English language learners. Many of the students attend a separate class during the day. It's called Imagine Learning. So depending on their situation, whether what grade they're in and what age they are and what year they are in learning English, it ranges, and they give them different kind of assignments and topics and everything so that they can learn English a little bit better. My first few visits were really minimal. I was never really engaged in communicating with the English language learner students or even really hearing them talk. Students were often, called on during classroom discussions, or they sit at groups. Each desk is set, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4. So they're in little groups, and sometimes they'd have discussions, and I was able to walk around and listen to them talk. But because I didn't really have a good enough interaction, I asked the teacher that I'm observing, her name is Miss James, I asked her if I could kind of discreetly take out 1 or 2 students and talk to them a little bit just to see if I could notice some of the errors that they were making. One student I really enjoyed speaking to in particular, his name was Marcus. He's 12 years old and he's an English language learner. His grandparents only speak Spanish. His mom and dad grew up speaking Spanish and learned English a little bit when they started needing to know it for the workforce. And Marcus and his brother and sister all grew up speaking Spanish and then started learning English when they were really young. He actively participates in the Imagine Learning program to continue learning his English, and he also helps out the younger kids in kindergarten and 1st and 2nd grade who are pretty much just all Spanish for right now. While I was getting to know him a little bit, I noticed the first phonology error he produced, turning the sound TH into a D, duh, just a really kind of slight D. So when he would say this, he ultimately sounded like he was saying dis. So when he was talking to me, he would say, "This is really cool, but this is really cool." So it's just a really common mistake that I noticed just because I grew up speaking English and I just say this. Another phonology error, I'm not sure if it was because of his Spanish speaking or just because he's almost a teenage boy, but if a word ended with a t sound, like don't or shouldn't, he completely took off the T sound. So he would say don't, shouldn't, and me speaking, I don't speak like that, I say shouldn't. And I make sure, even though I live in Utah and we say mountain and fountain, I still, am usually pretty good with saying don't, but he completely cut off the T and don't. So that was just a couple of the phonology errors that I had noticed. When it came to Marcus's phonology errors, I never really noticed Miss James actively correcting him when he would, cut off the T's or when he would say dis instead of this. Maybe she said it to him in passing, but it wasn't something that she actively was correcting in the lectures. Most of the syntax errors were hard to spot. When I took French in high school, and when we conjugated verbs, we always conjugated them like the ball of blue rather than the blue ball. And I don't speak Spanish at all, but when I was talking to my dad, he went on his mission to Guatemala, and so he spoke Spanish, and he said that that was kind of a little bit like Spanish speakers conjugate verbs. I noticed in one particular observation, a young English language learner student accidentally said something like the boy with hair brown, and then she quickly corrected herself and said the boy with brown hair. I only remember this particular student because she really talks out of turn a lot and she's pretty funny, so I wrote that down in my notes that I had, but that was just one really random thing. I don't know if that was a mistake or what, but she was putting the noun before the adjective. And I remember at the beginning of this course when Nate briefly discussed the topic of present perfect and simple past, and I literally had no idea what he was talking about. But I learned that present perfect is an action that started in the past and continues in the present. For example, she has lived here for 5 years. So she has lived here and continues living here, and she's lived here for 5 years. Most English language students, English language learner students only have a grasp on simple past, which is the action completed at a specific time. She graduated yesterday. She did this yesterday. Marcus said to me in our mini interview, I have been visiting the junior high a bunch of times already because I'm going there next year. He uses the continuing term has been to explain something that he has already done in the past. In English, I might have said, I visited the junior high a bunch already. When it came to the syntax errors, it was really easy for Miss James to point out what was going on. So when we had the one girl who confused the verb and adjective, then that was really easy for her to determine for herself. And when things happen like what Marcus said, it was really easy for me to say something and say, oh, didn't you mean you had visited, and just kind of fixing what he meant when it came to past, present, and future terms. Morphology errors are my favorite, not only because they're a common mistake amongst English language learners, but they can be common mistakes for really anybody who has been speaking English for a long time, even college students. I said one already. There, and there are some of the most common morphology errors needed writing with some of my observation students. I asked Mrs. James if I could maybe take a look at some of their journal entries and to see kind of if I could notice anything in writing. Another common morphology error is between this and these. This was something really, really specific because I was having a really hard time gathering some of this information, and so I asked Miss James if she notices a lot of stuff really happening, and I also asked the Imagine Learning teacher if she noticed anything, and this and these is one of the biggest mistakes that they notice. When talking about multiple items, such as they would say these pieces of paper, a student would often confuse them and say this pieces of paper. Morphology mistakes are immediately corrected when they're said in the classroom, especially because like common misuse there, and there, they stick out like a sore thumb in English grammar. So Miss James and the Imagine Learning teacher were really good about snatching those up and correcting those mistakes.